James Carter sat quietly on the subway, his backpack resting on his lap. He had been out running errands all day, and now he was just looking forward to getting home. The subway car rocked gently as it sped through the underground tunnels, the soft hum of the train mixing with the chatter of passengers. It was the usual mix of people, tired workers heading home, teenagers lost in their phones, and tourists looking around curiously. James had always been the kind of man who observed his surroundings. It was a habit from his years in the Marines, staying alert, watching for anything out of place. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he liked to know what was happening around him. As he scanned the subway car, his eyes settled on a young mother sitting a few seats away. The woman, Sarah, had her arm around her little girl, who looked about 6 years old. The child, Lily, had bright, curious eyes and was clutching a stuffed bunny, holding it close to her chest. She swung her legs back and forth, her little sneakers barely reaching the floor. James smiled slightly. Kids always had a way of bringing a little warmth to even the coldest places, like a dull subway car. Then something changed. As the train pulled into the next station, a man stepped inside. He looked around quickly before walking toward the middle of the car. Something about the way he moved caught James' attention. The man's eyes flickered back and forth, scanning the passengers, but his gaze kept returning to one spot: Lily and her mother. James' instincts sent a quiet alarm through him. The man wasn't acting like a normal commuter. Most people got on the subway, found a seat, and settled in. This man, however, seemed restless. He gripped the metal pole tightly, his fingers twitching slightly. His clothes were wrinkled, and his hair was messy, as if he hadn't taken care of himself in a while. But what concerned James most was the way the man kept shifting closer to Sarah and Lily, moving little by little with each stop. Sarah, unaware of the man's movements, was distracted. She had pulled out her phone, reading something on the screen, while keeping one hand gently resting on her daughter's leg. Lily, innocent and trusting, didn't notice anything unusual. She was humming softly to herself, playing with her bunny's ears. James, on the other hand, noticed everything. He could tell when someone was nervous, and this man was definitely on edge. His breathing was uneven, and he kept glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. But James was watching. He had seen this kind of behavior before: hesitation, planning, waiting for the right moment. James adjusted his position slightly, sitting up straighter. He wasn't going to take his eyes off this man. Something in his gut told him that this ride was about to take a dangerous turn. James kept his eyes on the man without making it too obvious. Years of training had taught him how to observe without drawing attention to himself. The man was standing near the subway doors, his body turned slightly towards Sarah and Lily. His fingers tapped against the metal pole, his eyes darting around as if checking to see if anyone was watching him. But James was watching, and he didn't like what he was seeing. The subway rocked gently as it sped forward, the lights above flickering slightly as it passed through a dark tunnel. Most of the passengers were lost in their own world, some scrolling through their phones, others staring blankly ahead, waiting for their stop. Nobody else seemed to notice the way the man kept inching closer to the little girl. Lily, completely unaware, was still playing with her stuffed bunny. She squeezed it tight, then placed it on the seat beside her as if giving it a little rest. Her legs swung back and forth, the tips of her sneakers just barely brushing the floor. She had no idea that someone was watching her. James noticed something else. The man wasn't just standing there. He was adjusting his position with every stop. When the subway slowed down, he moved a step closer. When it picked up speed again, he shifted slightly, getting nearer to Sarah and Lily without making it seem too obvious. James had seen this kind of behavior before. It wasn't random. It was calculated. Sarah, still unaware, was focused on her phone. She was probably reading a message or checking the train schedule. She didn't notice the way the man was moving closer. She didn't see how his eyes lingered on Lily for just a second too long. But James saw it all. His jaw tightened, His instincts told him that something wasn't right. He had been in enough situations to know when danger was near. His hands clenched into fists for a brief moment before he forced himself to relax. He couldn't act on suspicion alone, but he also couldn't ignore what was happening. Then the man did something that made James' heart pound faster. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. It wasn't a weapon, but a small piece of candy. James watched as the man held it in his fingers for a second, looking at Lily with a strange smile. The subway slowed as it approached the next stop. The man took a small step forward, glancing at Sarah, who was still distracted, then back at Lily. James leaned slightly forward, ready to move. His muscles tensed, his senses sharp. He didn't know what was about to happen next, but he was sure of one thing. If this man tried anything, James would be ready. The subway doors slid open with a soft chime, allowing a few passengers to step out while others shuffled in. The train barely stopped for more than a few seconds before the doors closed again, sealing everyone inside. The air inside the subway car felt a little heavier now. James could feel it. Something was about to happen. He kept his body relaxed, but his mind was sharp. His eyes locked on the man standing near Sarah and Lily. The man took another small step forward, now only inches away from them. His eyes flickered toward Sarah, but she was still looking at her phone, unaware of what was happening right beside her. Lily, still lost in her own little world, had placed her stuffed bunny on her lap and was looking at the advertisements above the subway seats. She had no idea that danger was so close. Then, in a sudden movement, the man bent slightly and reached out. His fingers wrapped around Lily's small wrist. Sarah's reaction was instant. She gasped loudly, her phone slipping from her fingers onto her lap. Her eyes widened in shock as she grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her daughter toward her. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice filled with panic. The subway car seemed to freeze for a second. Some passengers turned their heads, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. Others, caught up in their own world, remained unaware of what had just happened. The man, startled by Sarah's reaction, held up his hands as if trying to explain himself. His lips moved, but the words that came out were rushed and jumbled. I was just... He started, but his voice trailed off. His expression flickered between nervousness and frustration, as if he hadn't expected Sarah to react so quickly. But before he could say another word, James was already moving. With practiced control, James stood up, stepping between the man and Sarah. His presence alone was enough to make the man take a small step back. James wasn't a towering figure, but his posture, his confidence, and the sharpness in his gaze made it clear that he wasn't someone to mess with. "Let go of the girl," James said, his voice low but firm. There was no anger, no shouting, just a calm authority that made it impossible to ignore. The man hesitated. His eyes darted around the subway car, as if searching for a way out. He lifted his hands slightly, his palms open. "I didn't mean anything," he muttered, his voice shaky. "It was a mistake." Sarah, still holding Lily close, looked up at James with wide, grateful eyes. She was shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. Lily, frightened, buried her face against her mother's shoulder. James didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the man, waiting to see what he would do next. He could feel the tension in the air. The situation wasn't over yet. The subway car was silent for a moment. The kind of silence that comes when people are unsure of what to do next. The train rocked slightly as it sped forward, but all the attention inside the car was now on James and the man standing in front of him. Sarah held Lily tightly, her arms wrapped around her daughter, as if shielding her from any possible harm. James didn't move. He stood firm, his eyes locked on the man, watching for any sudden actions. His years in the Marines had taught him how to read people. The man was nervous, that much was clear. His hands twitched at his sides, his breathing uneven. He kept glancing around, as if looking for an escape or hoping that no one would interfere. "I didn't mean anything," the man repeated, his voice unsteady. He lifted his hand slightly, as if trying to show he wasn't a threat. But James wasn't convinced. He had seen situations like this before, people pretending to be harmless after getting caught doing something wrong. James took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His movements were controlled, calculated. "You grabbed a child," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's not a mistake." The man's eyes darted around again. A few passengers had pulled out their phones, recording the situation. Others were whispering to each other, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. But no one else stepped in. No one else moved. They were waiting to see what would happen next. The man swallowed hard. He looked like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His shoulders tensed. Then, in a quick, desperate motion, he tried to step around James, as if he could just walk away from the situation. But James was faster. In an instant, James reached out and grabbed the man's wrist, stopping him in his tracks. His grip was strong, unshakable. The man flinched, his body tensing at the sudden contact. He tried to pull away, but James didn't let go. "Sit down," James ordered, his voice still calm. But there was no room for argument. The man hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. He struggled for a second, trying to yank his arm free. But James had dealt with far stronger opponents before. With a slight movement, James twisted the man's wrist just enough to force him off balance. The man stumbled backward and fell onto an empty seat. A few passengers gasped. Sarah held Lily even tighter, whispering something comforting into her ear. James kept his stance firm, making sure the man didn't try anything else. "You're staying right there," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he wasn't going anywhere. The subway kept moving, but now the entire car was watching. Everyone knew this wasn't over yet. The subway car was still moving, but now the air inside felt heavy with tension. People were staring, some with their phones out, recording the situation. Sarah was holding Lily close, whispering softly to calm her down. The little girl clung to her mother, her face buried in Sarah's shoulder. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew something was wrong. James stood in front of the man, his body tense but controlled. The man sat on the subway seat, his hands trembling slightly. He looked around, his eyes darting from one person to another, as if searching for someone to help him. But no one spoke up for him. No one was on his side. He had been caught, and now he knew it. "You're not going anywhere," James said again, his voice calm but firm. The man swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything," he muttered, shaking his head. "It was a mistake. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." James didn't believe him. He had seen situations like this before, people pretending to be innocent after getting caught. But the truth was clear. The man had grabbed a child, and no one just accidentally does that. One of the passengers, an older woman sitting nearby, finally spoke up. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice shaking slightly. He grabbed the little girl's arm. The mother was right to react. Another person, a young man with a backpack, nodded. "Yeah, I saw it too. It wasn't an accident." The man's face turned pale. He looked at James, then at the people around him. He seemed to realize that there was no way out of this. Then, in a sudden move, he tried to stand up. Maybe he thought he could run to the other side of the train or push past James. But James was ready. The moment the man moved, James reacted. With quick reflexes, he grabbed the man's shoulder and pushed him back down onto the seat. It wasn't violent, just strong enough to let him know that he wasn't going anywhere. "I said stay down," James said, his tone even sharper now. The man froze. He looked up at James, and for the first time, there was real fear in his eyes. He realized now that he had no control over the situation. Sarah, still holding Lily, looked up at James. Her eyes were filled with gratitude and relief, but also fear. "Thank you," she whispered. James gave her a small nod but kept his focus on the man. He wasn't going to let his guard down. Not yet. The subway was slowing down. The next station was coming up. James knew that soon help would arrive. But until then, he wasn't going to let this man take another step. The train screeched as it approached the platform. The doors would open in a few seconds. James could already see uniformed officers waiting outside. The situation was almost over, but James kept his stance firm. He wasn't letting go until the police took over. The subway screeched to a stop, the overhead lights flickering slightly as the train settled into the station. A chime sounded, and the doors hissed open. Passengers shifted in their seats, some standing up, ready to leave. But no one near James moved. All eyes were on the man sitting stiffly in his seat, trapped under James' watchful gaze. Outside, 2 uniformed police officers stood on the platform. They had clearly been alerted by someone. Maybe a passenger had called or security cameras had picked up the commotion. Their eyes scanned the subway car quickly, and when they saw James standing over the man, they knew exactly where to go. James gave a slight nod toward the officers as they stepped inside. He didn't need to say anything. His body language and the way the passengers were looking at the man told them everything they needed to know. One of the officers, a tall man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Sarah, still holding Lily close, spoke up first. "That man grabbed my daughter's arm," she said, her voice still shaking. "I don't know what he was trying to do, but he touched her, and I didn't know him. This man," she glanced at James, "stopped him." The officer turned to James. "Is that true?" James nodded. "I was watching him the whole time. He kept moving closer to them, acting suspicious. Then he reached for the girl. When the mother reacted, he tried to brush it off, but I wasn't about to let him walk away." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, looked at the man still sitting in the seat. "Sir, stand up," she said firmly. The man hesitated. He looked around the subway car, as if hoping someone would defend him. But no one did. The passengers only stared at him in silence, their expressions cold and disapproving. The officer's voice was firmer this time. "I said, stand up." Slowly, the man obeyed, his movements stiff. His face had gone pale, and his hands trembled slightly. "I didn't do anything," he muttered. "It was a misunderstanding." The officers weren't convinced. "We'll talk about that at the station," the female officer said as she reached for her handcuffs. James took a step back, letting the officers do their job. He had done his part. Now it was in their hands. The man didn't resist as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He kept shaking his head, muttering under his breath. But he didn't fight back. Sarah let out a shaky breath as she watched him being taken away. Lily, still pressed against her mother's chest, peeked up with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, is it over?" she asked softly. Sarah kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." James watched as the officers led the man off the subway. He knew that while this moment was ending, the memory of it would stay with Sarah and Lily for a long time. But at least now, they were safe, and that was what mattered most. As the police officers led the man off the subway, a sense of relief washed over the passengers. The tension that had filled the air slowly began to fade. People whispered to each other, shaking their heads, still in shock over what had happened. Some put their phones away, satisfied that justice was being served. Sarah let out a long breath, holding Lily close. She could still feel her heart pounding in her chest. It had all happened so fast. One moment, they were just riding the train like any other day. And the next, a complete stranger had tried to touch her daughter. The thought made her shiver. She turned to James, who was now watching the officers step onto the platform with the man in handcuffs. He hadn't moved from his position, standing tall and steady, as if ready to react again if needed. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." James looked at her and gave a small nod. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just did what anyone should do." Sarah shook her head. "No, not everyone would have done what you did. You saw something was wrong, and you acted. That means a lot." Lily, still holding onto her stuffed bunny, looked up at James with big eyes. "You're really strong," she said in a small voice. "Are you a superhero?" A warm smile crossed James' face. He crouched down slightly to be at her level. "Not a superhero," he said with a chuckle. "Just someone who likes to help." Lily thought about that for a moment, then grinned. "I think you're a hero," she said confidently. James laughed softly and gave her a gentle nod. "Well, if you say so." The train doors slid shut, and the subway started moving again. The station faded into the distance as the train carried its passengers toward their destinations. People began to settle back into their routines, some returning to their books or phones, others lost in thought. But the energy in the subway car was different now. There was a quiet sense of respect toward James. Some passengers gave him small nods of appreciation, while others simply glanced at him with grateful expressions. Sarah finally relaxed a little. She loosened her grip on Lily, though she still kept her close. "Where are you heading?" she asked James. James shrugged. "Nowhere important. Just heading home." Sarah hesitated, then said, "Well, wherever you're going, I just want you to know that you made a difference today." James didn't respond right away. He had spent years serving in the military, protecting people in ways they would never even know. But moments like this, where he could directly help someone, felt different. They felt right. He gave Sarah a reassuring smile. "That's all that matters," he said. The train continued on, carrying them forward, leaving behind the fear and replacing it with something stronger: gratitude, safety, and the quiet presence of a man who refused to look away when someone needed help. As the subway continued its journey, the atmosphere inside the car gradually returned to normal. People went back to their conversations, their books, or their phones, but the memory of what had just happened lingered. Sarah still held Lily close, but now there was relief in her eyes instead of fear. James sat back down, his posture finally relaxing. He had done what needed to be done, and now life moved forward. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks, but he could feel the quiet appreciation from those around him. A few passengers still glanced in his direction, their expressions a mix of admiration and respect. Sarah looked at Lily, who had finally loosened her grip on her stuffed bunny. The little girl had been scared, but now she seemed calmer. She looked up at James again, curiosity in her innocent eyes. "Do you help people all the time?" she asked. James smiled. "I try," he said, "whenever I can." Sarah watched the interaction and felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had always taught Lily to be careful, but she never imagined something like this would happen to them. If James hadn't been there, she didn't even want to think about what could have happened. "You were really brave," Sarah said, meeting James' gaze. "Not just today, but in general. I can tell you've done this before." James shrugged slightly. "Old habits," he said. "I served in the Marines for a while. You learn to keep an eye on things." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "That makes sense. I knew there was something about you, just the way you reacted so fast." James didn't say much, just gave a small nod. He didn't see himself as special. To him, helping others was simply the right thing to do. As the train neared the next station, Sarah realized they would soon be going their separate ways. She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She quickly wrote something down and tore off a piece of paper. "Here," she said, handing it to James. "That's my number. If you ever need anything, or if you just want to grab a coffee sometime, let me know. It's the least I can do." James looked at the paper for a moment, then took it with a nod. "I appreciate it," he said. The subway slowed, and the doors slid open. Sarah stood up, taking Lily's hand. "Come on, sweetheart. she said softly. Then she turned back to James. Take care of yourself. You too, James replied. Lily gave him a big smile and waved. Bye, hero, she said cheerfully. James chuckled and gave her a small wave in return. Bye, kiddo. As Sarah and Lily stepped onto the platform and disappeared into the crowd, James sat back and exhaled. Another ordinary day had turned into something unexpected. But in the end, he was just glad that the right thing had been done. The train doors closed, and the subway moved forward once again, carrying James toward whatever was next.